Welcome to the first UF College Republicans meeting. We have two very special guests today. We have Ed and Kai. Kai from the beautiful state of Utah. And Ed as well has a lot of very good political experience. Kai is a political commentator. I think they both have a lot of very interesting things to say for everybody in this room. I would like to thank Rift TV. I know they helped a lot with the setup, so I want to give a quick shout out to them, say thank you. And with that in mind, I will let Kai take the stage first. Come up here, Kai. Let's hear what you got to say.
Thank you very much. Ooh, what a beautiful crowd, seriously. There's a joke in here that I was really planning was going to land well, but I don't even know if it'll land. I have one Indian joke, which are very topical, but I don't know if it's going to land. I think Ed's maybe the closest, but he's British. But I am very excited to be with you guys today. My name, as was said before in my introduction, is Kai Schwemmer. I'm a campus speaker, a political commentator, and most of you probably saw me on a recent episode of Jubilee called 20 Progressives versus, or one progressive versus 20 far-right conservatives. This was with Mehdi Hasan, obviously featured. He's a former MSNBC political pundit and correspondent. It was really funny to give you guys some of the behind the scenes. Nobody really knew who he was when he walked in, so we were all just kind of quiet. We didn't really know, but since then, obviously, that video has amassed, I think as of yesterday, over 11 million views on YouTube. So it is very large. Unfortunately, the moments where I was speaking were not, in fact, the most clipped of the entire video, which ended up being a little bit more controversial. But I think no intent to be too self-aggrandizing or to praise myself too highly. But I do believe that the conversation I had with Mehdi was by far the most telling and certainly interrogated his worldview the best. And we'll be talking a little bit today about what we discussed with Mehdi, but also what is today the most important question in all of American politics, and that is, what is an American? A question that only as of, I think, a week ago, some of the most popular conservative and Republican politicians and speakers and influencers have even had the guts to say. Very many people have totally avoided this question. They'd much rather talk about, maybe what makes America special, but they would very much like to avoid the question of what actually is an American and how we ought to be providing that label. And that's a little bit of what I'd like to talk about today, expanding on some of the stuff I talked about with Mehdi. Since our debate, I've done plenty of research into this topic, and as with most issues where there's this big left-right divide, the more you look into it, the more thoroughly convinced you become of the conservative position. And that's due to the simple fact that the conservative view aligns with the vision that the founding fathers had for this country, which means whenever we interrogate some of these historic positions or some of these controversial issues, the facts remain on the side of the people who founded the country. And they remain, obviously, on our side as well. And when you ask some of these political pundits like Mehdi Hasan, or when you ask a liberal like Destiny, or as I have done, I've asked Mehdi Hasan, I've asked Chris Mowry, I've asked Dean Withers, what are the answers that they'll come up with as far as what is an American, what constitutes being an American? Well, what they'll tell you is 9 digits, a social security number. And I'd just like to say, because it's not often set straight, the record is not often clarified, that argument completely exposes the way in which their views are only a surface level examination of the true facts of any particular idea or debate. Those individuals, Mehdi and other progressives like Chris Mowry and Dean Withers, if they were able to Google and investigate this topic just a little bit more, would quickly find out that it's actually not just American citizens who have social security numbers. It's also lawful permanent residents, work or non-workers who have visas to be in this country, and in those cases, sometimes students. Those individuals also, at times, can have social security numbers. So the obvious question is a lawful permanent resident as much of an American as a social security holder who is an American citizen? The answer is obviously no. So it must not be. The basis of our Americanism must not just be these 9 magic digits that once attributed to any individual from anywhere in the world make them American. But some of you may have recently seen and may have watched that video. You may have seen the way in which the liberals then fall back and try to defend their position a little bit more. What they fall back on is one of the most predictable things ever. And what's that? It's precedent. And that is very ironic. If they once again were able to analyze and were able to examine part or any portion, especially the beginning portion of this nation's history, they would find that the precedent is absolutely not on their side. But frankly, we all know they don't at all care about precedent. They care about precedent insofar as it allows them to score some points in a debate that will be then monetized on YouTube or that will be shown and clipped up. And for as much as they criticize Charlie Kirk, some of these new left-wing faces are basically doing what he does, but somehow worse. It's oftentimes like a bad looks competition. I don't know what happens. It's like they're trying to beat each other, and somehow they keep one-upping each other. But let's begin. Let's begin this conversation today, this speech, by discussing some of the facts about birthright citizenship, because these are super important. The average Republican will be able to tell you, and this is the talking point you will hear on Fox News, that birthright citizenship arose as a response to the vast amount of African Americans in this country who were not recognized as citizens of the United States despite their historic presence in the nation. That is correct. The ratification of the 14th Amendment with its citizenship clause included did have the original intent of enfranchising and seeing as citizens the African American that was in the country at that time. That was the original intent. They did consider that as their motive. The intent was obviously not to offer citizenship freely, practically, to millions of people. And in order to find that, in order to investigate the way that these, congressional or these congressmen and women, the way they were thinking about the issue, we can look exactly at the congressional debates. And it's funny, whenever I mention that to liberals or to progressives, they always retort with this same response. Well, how do you know what they were thinking? Are you like, what's happening inside their heads? They wrote things down. Most of this is recorded history. Congressional debates have been recorded. They've been published online, actually. So anybody who is willing to invest the time is actually able to see exactly the debate that occurred in the chambers of Congress. So let's look exactly at that. And we'll quickly find that it is not that these congressmen and women were just trying to support a world in which somebody could time the due date of their baby with their vacation to the United States and thereby create an American son or daughter. So let's look at Senator Jacob Howard, who happened to be the individual who proposed the language of the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment. Well, let's see what Senator Jacob Howard said. Tell me if this is, kind of difficult, maybe it's a little bit opaque, or tell me if this is a pretty easily understandable reasoning and a line of thinking that he is going to take us through. He proposed the Citizenship Clause and said, this is a quote, "This will not, of course, include persons born in the United States who are foreigners, aliens who belong to the families of ambassadors, of foreign ministers, accredited to the government of the United States." Now, the average individual who's reading a document from centuries ago is going to read "or" into those phrases. They are abbreviated with commas. We don't know how perfect the transcription of the record and the debate was, but most people, when reading what Senator Howard says, would read it this way. And it's the same thing, but I'm including the words that we think in our head when we read it. Because again, we don't know how well this was transcribed. We're talking like, the late half of the 19th century here. It says, "This will not, of course, include persons born in the United States who are foreigners, comma, aliens, comma, or, comma, if you use the Oxford Comma, who belong to the families of ambassadors, of foreign ministers, accredited to the government of the United States, but will include every other class of persons." That to us seems easily interpretable. It seems very clear that Senator Howard is saying those are the people who will be excluded. Foreigners, the children of foreign ministers, and aliens. And everybody else will be included. And who are we talking about? African Americans, who have been unjustly denied the citizenship in this country despite their participation in the foundation of the country. Well, in order to respond to this, some liberals, and this is not the kind of liberal engagement with the topic that you'll find in a YouTube video or in a Destiny stream. This is an engagement that you'll only find in like long Substack articles, but I have done that research. I've gone to find, well, what is the response? Well, the retort, which is taken from Grammarly.com, is that, well, in some cases, the lack of an "or" implies that he's adding the prior words as modifiers of the last thing he says. So in this case, it would read, "Foreigners and aliens who belong to the families, to the government," or hold on, "Foreigners and aliens who belong to the families of ambassadors, of foreign ministers, accredited to the government of the United States." It would not be three separate groups, but rather one, with the prior two words acting as modifiers to the idea of the child of a foreign minister, right?
Okay, well, even if that's the case, let's look at some of the ways that the most progressive politicians of the time in that same Congress talked about this same issue of birthright citizenship. Let's look at a progressive senator who was a Republican, but quite progressive, perhaps because he himself was an Irish immigrant, and it's the Irish every single time, right at the beginning of all our problems. No, but let's look at this Irish politician, this Irish immigrant, U.S. politician, but an Irish immigrant. His name is John Conness. He is a Republican from California. Well, he was one of the most progressive politicians talking about the birthright citizenship clause, and let's see what he said. He gave a big rebuttal to another senator who raised a fear that birthright citizenship might enable an invasion of the United States by foreign populations, a concern that we have now, in the reality seen was true. This was a legitimate fear. But let's look at the response that progressive John Conness gives. He says, and I quote, "Here is a simple declaration that a score or a few scores of human beings born in the United States shall be regarded as citizens of the United States, entitled to civil rights, to the right of equal defense, to the right of equal punishment for crime with other citizens, and that such a provision should be deprecated by any person having or claiming to have a high humanity passes all my understanding and comprehension." And you can tell what kind of a person this is. Like if I were to write this down as like the dialogue to one of these left-wing TikTok debaters, it would map on like one for one. Maybe you throw in a few more Gen Z buzzwords, but it's literally the way they talk about this same topic. You have the moralizing towards the end. Oh, it surpasses all my understanding and comprehension. Anyone of a high morality would easily oppose this idea of shutting down birthright citizenship. The way he talks about it is exactly the way that our politicians talk about this issue today. But here is the important part that some of you might have picked up on. How many people is he talking about? How many people does he believe birthright citizenship would apply to? Here's the sentence. Here's a simple declaration that a score or a few scores of human beings born in the United States shall be regarded as citizens of the United States entitled to civil rights, to the right of equal defense, to the right of equal punishment for crime with other citizens. That's the statement. A score or a few scores. Well, how many is a score? Some of you know the Gettysburg Address, are familiar with that term. You had to learn it in middle school or high school, I don't know. It's referring to an amount of 20. Now, there are cases in which we talk about a score not as the numerical value 20, but rather as some extraordinarily large number, in which case we would say scores of people. We could say scores of people are flooding across the southern border. Well, that's not what Representative or Senator John Conness said. He said that a score or a few scores. His language is specific and distinct. He is not talking about millions of people the way that we are seeing our country become the recipient of millions of people immigrating across the southern border. He is talking about 20 or scores, numerals of 20 people. We're talking maybe hundreds, max. That is absolutely incomparable to the amount of immigration that we are receiving in this country today. And so this precedent, the context within which the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, is completely, worlds different from the context in which we live today. But of course, the whole conversation about the precedent really isn't anything to be worrying about. And that is exactly what I tried to interrogate with our friend Mehdi Hassan. I asked him a simple question. Mehdi, and this is a question you could ask of any of your politicians, Republican and Democrat, are you in favor, or do you believe, rather, you don't even have to agree with it, do you believe that the Constitution or important amendments therein could be eroded by purely legal and democratic processes? And he replied, no, I don't think so. Okay, well, I'll ask him another question because that was a little, I was leading him on too much there. I'll ask a more hidden, a more subtle question. Mehdi Hassan, if you could legally and lawfully get rid of the Second Amendment, would you be in favor of that? And then he responds, oh, absolutely, I'd be in favor of that, And it's like, that's actually the same thing, Mehdi. If you legally are changing the Constitution, if you are legally changing its character, the principles contained therein, certain amendments, if you're completely changing it, you are eroding it. And erosion is a particular term. It's one that I chose very carefully. The reason I choose the word erosion is because it's not something that happens all of a sudden, and often it doesn't even appear intentional. But don't get it twisted. It absolutely is. These people know, and these people are counting on the fact that we will not recognize a death by 1,000 cuts. They are waiting for us to fall one step at a time into the eventual collapse of the Constitution that allows this country to exist. And all the way there, they will rely on our virtue. They will allow on our love for the Constitution to defend poor Supreme Court precedent. They will tell us that they're concerned about law and order, that they don't like Trump's executive order about birthright citizenship because it's illegal, when in reality, legality is nothing they're worried about. They are happy to take reign of the government. They are happy when they are in power to abuse the force of the government to forcefully inject individuals with medicine that has not properly been studied. They're absolutely in favor of locking people down in a time of need. They're absolutely in favor of crushing civil disobedience. They're absolutely in favor of it. Constitutionality, precedent doesn't matter to them one wink. The precedent about the Second Amendment, something much more American than birthright citizenship, something that literally identifies America within the world, our culture of guns, our culture of the freedom and the right to bear arms. They are happy to get rid of it because for them, it's not a policy they agree with. And in reality, they don't agree with the Constitution. They don't believe some of the fundamental ideas. They don't believe in God-given rights. They don't believe with the opening sentences of some of the most important documents that have built this country and made it exactly what it was. So talking to any kind of progressive about precedent is not a winning battle because they don't care. They never cared. From the very onset, they didn't care. And that was what I tried to expose in Mehdi, and it was something that he at least admitted to, that he doesn't care about precedent on issues like gun rights, but he does care about precedent on issues like birthright citizenship. But let's actually talk a little bit more about this country's precedent because we do care about it. The question of our country's precedent, the question of what our country has been is very important in answering the question, what is an American? So let's talk a little bit about that. And by the way, the rapid demographic and cultural changes that are being entertained through birthright citizenship and through immigration legally and illegally, the way that we've been seeing it since the Hart-Celler Act in 1965, and particularly in the last 2 decades, are of course also approved without batting an eye by Democrats and progressives, because that allows them to win elections, and thereby nationalism or any kind of nationalistic populist sentiment among the people is thwarted. If a people is not consistent, if a people do not have an identity, well, what do they collect around? And we've already seen that in Europe. People no longer identify with their nations. They identify with subgroups. They identify with tinier ethnic groups. We see all kinds of splintering occurring in Europe, and that's because the nation no longer unifies them. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now in America. It starts with, Chinatowns, and it starts with Little Italies, but where it ends up is entire sections of the country leaving. And it ends with entire cities literally legally recognizing federal holidays, or rather state-level holidays, that show reverence to the Mexican Independence Day. That's insane. Celebrating the Independence Day of a foreign nation in your own nation is absolutely a sign of the kind of schism that I am describing. But let's jump back. Let's jump to the real American precedent. Only 14 years after the ratification of the 14th Amendment and the Citizenship Clause that was contained therein, and there's more to say there, but we'll have to skip it for the sake of brevity. Only 14 years after that was ratified, what happened? That same Congress, many of the same individuals who ratified the 14th Amendment, saw obviously that immigration was becoming too much of an issue. So what did they sign? What did they pass? The Chinese Exclusion Act. You're telling me that the Congress of the time was totally aware of millions of people coming over, that was their intention. Their intention was to grant citizenship to everybody who was born here. Well, it doesn't really seem that way. When 14 years later, they're saying, oh crap, this is getting kind of out of hand. We need to completely bar the immigration of Chinese laborers for 10 years at least. Okay, boom, nice moratorium. That's good. We're slowing stuff down. So what happens after the 10 years? Well, let's analyze. Nope, we're going to actually extend it another 10 years. They signed the Geary Act. They extended the Chinese Exclusion Act 10 more years. Okay, well, what about after 20 years? Well, what happened? 10 years later, it was made permanent in 1902. The then Teddy Roosevelt, 4 years later, signed the Naturalization Act of 1906. And you know what this required? It required, in order to be naturalized, the learning of the English language. You want to talk to me about precedent? You want to talk to me about what kind of immigration we were having? And you want to act? You want to play as if the Congress of the time that passed birthright citizenship had in mind, millions of people from foreign countries coming here and having children who, couldn't even maybe speak the language, the national language of the country, which is English? Well, Teddy Roosevelt said very clearly, no, actually, Under this 1906 Act, the Naturalization Act, the only people who we will naturalize as American citizens will be white men who are free, who speak English. That's not even all Europeans. The national history around immigration is absolutely restriction. It is not open borders to everybody, as Mehdi Hassan attempted to claim during our debate. But that was, one of the very many times in which he lied. He also said that Won Kim Ark, which was, by the way, the constitutional precedent regarding birthright citizenship for the son of immigrants, Won Kim Ark, his parents were Chinese immigrants. Well, guess what? During this Chinese Exclusion Act process, he wanted to take a trip and couldn't really come back, and it was a bit of an issue. Well, what happened? Well, in the debate Mehdi and I had, he tried to claim that Won Kim Ark's parents were undocumented. They were not. They were lawful permanent residents. They had resided in the United States for over 20 years. It is an apples to oranges comparison with the kind of immigration that we're having right now. It is apples to oranges when comparing that with having birthright citizenship, like we do today, extended automatically to the child of two immigrants who have come here illegally, which does not make sense in any world. You ask anybody. If an individual's parents have both violated the law in coming to this country, why is their son or daughter more allegiant to the nation that they have illegally entered than those parents' home nations? Everybody knows that the child will not be more allegiant to this country. Certainly, what would be the reason to suppose they would be? And yet, that's the way that we're running our citizenship and the birthright citizenship that we have in this country right now. But I wanted to add just one more little thing on this caveat and on the context of the early 20th century and talking about, these exclusions, these restrictions. One of the funniest cases that I found, which I do have to give credit to somebody in my TikTok comments mentioned this to me, and I thought it was a parody. I thought this was like some Onion article that was written some form of early 20th century Onion or Babylon Bee, was writing some article that was fake. No, this was real. This was a real Supreme Court case that happened, and it was titled, United States versus Bhagat Singh Thind. So I am assuming you guys know what the national origin is of the individual who was challenging the Supreme Court. Bhagat Singh Thind did not attempt to challenge the exclusionary nature of the United States policy about immigration. Instead, he, an Indian man, tried to argue, like many still do on the internet, that he was in fact an Aryan. You got to give him some credit. I mean, he pioneered it. Right? People are still using that to this day. They're still going for it. He attempted to claim and argue for the Supreme Court that he was of Proto-Indo-European descent, thereby legally Caucasian. The Supreme Court said, no, I think most people can see it's like you're not really white, sorry. So anyway, that's just a little bit of a tangent there, but I thought it was a really funny case in which the actual understanding of the court and of the nation was very clearly displayed. Yeah, it's cool, dude. I see the encyclopedia. I understand what you're saying. You're Caucasian. Maybe you're a Scythian. I don't know. Okay, that's all right. But you're not really white. Sorry, man. So, unfortunately, it did not work out for our buddy Bhagat Singh Thind, but he did allow us to have a nice view into the minds of the Supreme Court at the time. But unfortunately, despite all of this precedent, despite the way that this country was, despite the way that we have been for such a long time, despite the fact that we were for a very long time relatively homogeneous, the fact that we had a clearly defined white Anglo-Saxon Protestant background, that we had a Christian law that very much informed the kind of legality that we saw, that we had our legal system also derived from the idea of an English common law, despite the fact that we had so many things in common, and despite the fact that nativism is actually probably the most consistent thing across any decade or any century of the United States' history, we are still fooled, and conservatives still turn into libertarians with all of this mind rotting that happens because of the Democrats who try to convince them that any attempt to address these questions through an executive order or anything that seems less than legal is truly un-American. Well, really, increasingly nowadays, the decision is between doing something that is legally dubious, that might, force the hand of the courts in the way that Trump's executive order about birthright citizenship is doing, something that they, by the way, will be reconsidering and attempting to rule on again, if I'm not mistaken, in October, which is a fantastic result. Can we actually clap for that? There's a few things to clap about, but that's real. To force the hands of the courts is unironically probably one of the best things that has happened under the Trump presidency. And this is something that he does pretty well consistently. He'll think about something, he'll be like, that doesn't really sound quite right. And he'll like pass an executive order because he's not a super good executive, admittedly. That's not his strong suit. He can't really pass a lot of policy. But what he can do is force a conservative court, a conservative-leaning court, which will have an original intent in mind, to rule again on crucial cases, such as, for example, the case of abortion, such as, for example, this latest issue, which is where this same issue I was describing has been most apparent, that being the burning of the American flag. We have a Supreme Court precedent that goes, well, now, if you want to talk about American precedent, man, the burning of the American flag, now that is, everybody knows, everybody was taught in their civics class that there is nothing more American than allowing for the burning of the American flag. That's like your First Amendment right, dude. That's like the most American thing ever, dude. Your like ancestors who built this country, they actually died so that you could burn the American flag. That was like what they were fighting for. That, of course, is a lie. This is Supreme Court precedent that dates back to 1989. A particular case, which was called, hold on, I wrote this down. And this is fantastic. I was writing the speech and I look up in the news. Oh, there we go. It's like these live updates have been fantastic. This particular case, I feel like I did write it down. This 1989 order. It was, and somebody might have to help me out. It was Katie versus, I may have not even written it down. Katie versus? Texas. There we go. That's your Supreme Court precedent. That's 1989. At the state level, plenty of states had already penalized, they'd applied penalties, they had made illegal the burning of the red, white, and blue, of our beautiful flag. They had made it illegal at the state level in plenty of places. This is an issue wherein we see a super clear blind spot for the Republican Party today. When Donald Trump passes an executive order doing something that is obviously in the national interest, obviously aligned with American identity, admittedly in a way which is demonstrating poor executive decision-making, a poor thinking process. He literally just like wakes up and says, that's kind of bad. That's like, people are burning the flag. That's like screwed up. This will make that illegal. And they're like, well, it doesn't really work like that. But again, he's going to force the hands of the courts. They're going to have to re-examine the decision, a decision which, by the way, was only a 5-4 decision, which now with a conservative court may change. This move by President Trump is unequivocally a positive movement as far as our respect for our national identity. And yet, what do Republicans do? They do exactly what we've been describing. They cower and they say, well, I might be a diehard MAGA Republican, but Trump, that's a First Amendment right. You're actually going against my freedom to express myself. Burning the flag is symbolic speech. Didn't you read the Supreme Court case? And none of them have read it, of course. None of them know about, the qualifications of fighting words or of incitement, or none of them know about, the three-pronged Miller test. None of them know about the way that constitutionally pornography really isn't protected speech. None of them know about that, which is why all of them will claim that it is protected speech, and they'll say, well, if you're trying to do that, that's anti-American. If you're trying to ban pornography, that's as anti-American as it gets. That's like, pornography is like so American. It's as American as burgers. It's as American as guns. No, it's not actually. It's actually not. And the Constitution has actually allowed us to legislate morality in such ways. But getting back to the topic of the flag, this to me is an unequivocally good decision. Make no mistake about it. Making it illegal to incite treason and mutiny against the country, demonstrated through burning the flag, is absolutely a good decision. People are going to raise these concerns, as many people have already done in my Instagram DMs, that, well, this is going to be difficult to legislate, and, what do you know? How can you measure somebody's intent in burning the flag? How do you know they're doing it maliciously? Well, I think it's pretty clear. I think we have seen across campuses across the nation, we've seen all over protests, during the Black Lives Matter protests, during our Summer of Love, during plenty of protests during the nation's history, the burning of the American flag as an act of treason, often accompanied by real, true violence. And Trump was also right to point out violence in both directions. This is an insightful act. You truly are trying to shut down and trying to denigrate the very colors that are supposed to unite people as a nation. So, to me, it's very easy to consider this executive order even within the realm and the world of the constitutional precedent the way it exists now. But yet again, conservatives turn into libertarians. They worry about it. They worry about it in every single step of the way. They are puppeteered along by Democrats who are excited that they are defending the burning of the flag. I'm sorry, Republicans, but those founding stock of Americans did not die so that you could burn the flag that they actually died trying to hoist up. That was not their intent. They did not suffer and die fighting wars for this country under that flag so that you would have more of a right to burn it and to rebel against this nation. That is not what they died for. That was not their intent. And frankly, within the conversation of what it means to be an American, within the conversation of what it means to be an American citizen, it is a bare minimum that we venerate, or at least respect in some degree, the flag to which we pledge allegiance. Some of you remember maybe in elementary school when you were pledging allegiance to the flag. Why don't we do that more? I don't know if this is just a Utah thing, but I stopped doing that in middle school. Why did we stop pledging allegiance to the flag? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I may have even butchered that because it's been so long since they required me to do it. But the point remains. This was the rallying cry. In every school, whether or not an individual was a citizen, they pledged allegiance to the flag. And if somebody wants to become a citizen, they have to take an exam of 100 questions. And at the end of that exam, what do? They pledge allegiance to the United States of America. Requiring English as a prerequisite for immigration and citizenship is not radical. It was the precedent in the country and it ought to remain so. Requiring that we pledge allegiance to the flag and respect it, and that it's burning, the mutiny against this country, or at least the object that represents it, be illegal, is not radical. It is precedent. It is a perspective that favors and takes serious this nation's history and this nation's future. That is what I have to say about American citizenship and the importance of this recent executive order making illegal the burning in a malicious way of the United States flag. There's unfortunately one thing that, while I was doing a little bit of closing writing this morning, that came across the Twitter feed and across the news that I was reading, and that is something that I feel I don't want to leave unaddressed, which is the shooting of several children, of over a dozen children at a Catholic school in Minneapolis this morning. This is something that I can't stand here and virtue signal about, but it is something that it absolutely needs to be mentioned. Obviously, the hearts of everybody who are in this room, and certainly all across America, of every Catholic in the nation who are our Christian brothers and sisters, we absolutely are thinking about those families and about those children. And I think what's worse is that every individual has allowed the conversation about the shooter's motives to turn into a massive grift, which I believe personally was the motive of the shooter, to write every single controversial political opinion, anything from a slur to a mention of Jewish people to a mention of the LGBT community, so that every aisle of politics could decide the shooter's motives and assign them to their enemy. I think that was exactly the point. This was certainly a motive. The motive of the shooter was certainly to get attention. It was to provoke more attention and to fulfill it in an egoistic way. I don't think we ought to play into this, but it certainly has caused me to reflect a little bit more about what our motives need to be in having these conversations. A lot of people are not super big fans of the way I conduct myself or style my content or the way that I have conversations with people or debates that I had earlier today on campus, and it's because I am not very inflammatory, or at least I don't try to be. I don't come off as very rambunctious, maybe high energy, but certainly not maybe up to par with what a lot of people are used to, especially in more dissonant politics. I'm from Utah. I'm LDS. This is something that I think is kind of in my blood. It's this yearning to be a nice guy, to be kind to people. But the more I read the scriptures, the more I read the words of Jesus Christ, the more I feel compelled to emphasize that as a part of the way I present myself and talk about my politics. Truly, the things we've been talking about today do not stem and come from a hate for our neighbor or for any other nation in the world, but rather a profound love for America and a desire to see it continue into the future, and a desire for every American individual to have the best life they can have. Obviously, we ought to extend our sincerest condolences to anybody who is negatively affected, but it is important to remember that we as Christians are not doing anything wrong when we are advocating for national interest. That is not at all an issue. That being said, in the way that we conduct ourselves, I love verses from Ephesians, and this is not to come off holier than thou. This is not to be a preacher here, because politics and religion often, when brought together, tend to bankrupt the latter rather than uplift it. Rather than inspiring our politics, we tend to allow our politics to inspire our faith. But I do love these Paul in Ephesians 4, verses 31 and 32, which say, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. And be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you." I know that that's true. I absolutely know that Christ has forgiven us. I know that as many times as we repent, he will forgive us. And I know as well that we have a duty, we have a responsibility to make these views, which are not radical, unlike the way that people will make them out to be, unlike what they say about us, unlike the hate that they ascribe to our motives. I absolutely know that we have a duty to love. I know that our positions are derived from love. Although it may not always sound like that, I strive absolutely to make that more and more true every time I speak. I thank you all for doing the same. Thank you very much.